Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colin Bailey, the Director of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here this afternoon. I hope you're as happy and as inspired as we are, the staff of the museums, by this marvelous exhibition. We're immensely proud to have organized the important retrospective of the last decade of David Hockney's work, in which we are showing 398 works. It's the largest exhibition at the Fine Arts Museums. A plethora of media, work from oil on canvas to watercolor, charcoal on paper, synchronized digital videos, iPad drawings, printed large and mounted on die bond. This has been a labor of love for our Deputy Director, Richard Benefield, working in close collaboration, great harmony with Gregory Evans, curator of the exhibition. They have done a wonderful job, and our heartfelt thanks go to them both. As you know, the exhibition fills all of the Herbst exhibition galleries on this floor, as well as 3 rooms on the first floor. Among the works there, you will see Hockney's The Great Wall of 2000, David Hockney's chronological investigation into the history of depiction from the Renaissance to post-Impressionism. This research informed his book of 2001, Secret Knowledge, Recovering the Lost Techniques of the Old Masters, and it's shown publicly here for the first time. I've said before that this is an extraordinarily brave, frank, and revealing exhibition with a concentration of very recent work. Certain of the portraits in acrylic made their way here from Hockney's studio in Los Angeles as the paint was still drying, and they are so new that we were not able to include them in the splendid catalogue, which I have here, which you should all buy, in the splendid catalogue that our publications worked so hard to produce in close collaboration with David, Gregory, and their colleagues. And as we walk through the exhibition, we really cannot but be struck by the scale, the exuberance, the vitality of David Hockney's colorism, while at the same time, every space reminds us how important drawing is, the role of drawing in David's production at every stage, be it on paper, in charcoal or watercolor, or on the iPhone or the iPad. And it's an intensely personal retrospective. The landscapes of East Yorkshire, the narrow Roman road of Waldgate, the coastal village of Bridlington, these are sites of significance for the artist, and he returns to document the seasons changing there every year. And we see in the portraits a tremendous range, from the Angra-like camera lucida drawings of 1999 to the watercolors of 2002 to the recent verticals in acrylic, which several people have remarked to me remind them of late Matisse, and I think the Matissean palette is very, very much there. Through these portraits, we are also introduced to David's close friends and studio assistants, his inner circle. Above all, I think we can't but be moved by the scale of the exhibition. The scale, a bigger exhibition, not merely the numbers, but also the momentum, the feeling. It's David Hockney's monumentality and grandeur that informed the title of our show. In his recent landscapes, an unwavering command of space, atmosphere, and light is everywhere present. He has suggested that we, the viewer, populate each of these grand vistas, which are empty of the human presence. Confronting the large iPad drawings of Yosemite, in the same room as David Hockney's variations on Loren's Sermon on the Mount from the Frick collection. The Frick collection's never had it so good, actually, in this exhibition. We see Colorado side by side with the Mount of Beatitudes, and we are struck, as in so many of these galleries, by the sublimity of nature. In his 70s, David Hockney exhibits absolutely none of the characteristics ascribed to advancing age in artists by Kenneth Clark in a celebrated essay some years ago. Clark wrote, "A sense of isolation, a feeling of holy rage, transcendental pessimism, these informed, for him, the late artists. None of these categories can be applied to David Hockney's recent work." In fact, if we return to Matthew Arnold's poem, Growing Old, Hockney turns every generalization of aging on its head. What is it to grow old? Asked the 35-year-old poet in 1867. Is it to lose the glory of the form, the luster of the eye? Is it for beauty to forego her wreath? For David Hockney, in his 76th year, it is most decidedly not to do any of those things. The glory of the form, the luster of the eye, beauty's wreath. terms that are precisely applicable to this exhibition. In fact, by this definition, David Hockney remains one of our youngest artists, one who, to continue with Matthew Arnold, sees the world as from a height with rapt prophetic eyes and heart profoundly stirred. Now, this afternoon, I'm delighted to introduce to you Lawrence Weschler, our speaker, and a great friend of David Hockney's, a great authority on his work, a contributor to our catalogue. Lawrence Weschler was a staff writer at The New Yorker for 20 years, and for the past 12 years has been director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU. He is a two-time winner of the George Polk Award and was also a recipient of the Lannan Literary Award in 1998. His book, Everything That Rises, A Book of Convergences, received the 2007 National Books Critics Circle Award for criticism. Mr. Weschler has been writing about David Hockney regularly since 1982, when his text for the Camera Works volume was published. A few years ago, he gathered 25 years of writing in a book called True to Life. Weschler shared important insights into Hockney's work through his astute essays for the Handsome Catalogue that we've published. He's also been very gracious in creating for us a panel discussion on the 22nd of November on Hockney's theory that the Old Masters were aided by use of optical devices. And on the 23rd of November, a symposium, Wide Advantages Are Needed Now, times 18, will explore Hockney's use of multiple vantage points and its potential implications for practitioners from Hollywood to Silicon Valley. Lawrence Weschler's remarks this afternoon will be being recorded and will be available as a podcast. So for those who are here, you can hear this again. For those who have not been able to be with us, you will have a chance to be virtually with us next week. Please join me in welcoming Lawrence Weschler to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So let me see if I can get this right. Anyway, I was hoping to give you a little background to what you'll see in the show generally, and because it seems to me that what really comes through in a show which focuses, admittedly, on the last 10 years is a passion of David's that started in the 70s and really has a real breaking point in the early 80s. If you remember, David Hockney toward the mid-70s was doing one painting after another. They're iconic today. This sort of painting of Henry Geldzahler looking at masterpieces, or rather, to be specifically, looking at reproductions of masterpieces. Parc de Vichy, a portrait of three people. One of them has gotten up to do the painting, actually. This sort of thing, famously, Ossie and Celia and Percy the cat. These paintings, one after another, there's a whole series. They're usually two, maybe three people portraits. And he could have gone on doing this sort of thing for the rest of his life, and his dealers would have been very, very happy. These are very, very popular. But all through this later period, he's beginning to have a problem, and he can't quite articulate what it is, but it has something to do with one-point perspective, with the vice of one-point perspective. He is using photographs a good deal as kind of sketches. He'll take photographs as he's doing these pictures, but photographs enforce a vice-like, any camera photograph enforces a vice-like one-point perspective, and in fact, he suddenly begins to find that there's a distortion that happens, and so when he does that painting, for example, he makes a joiner, as he calls them, these to get it correct. The photograph is wrong. You really take 3 or 4 photographs to get it right. As he says in those days, photography is all right if you don't mind looking at the world from the point of view of a paralyzed cyclops for a split second. But that's not what the world is like. So he's continuing to do this and more ambitiously, but he hits a wall with this picture, Santa Monica Boulevard, which he works on for months and months and months. It's the view from across the street of his Santa Monica Boulevard studio. And he never shows this. In fact, it's never finished. And what, in fact, he is working on, and he can't even quite articulate yet, is this problem of one-point perspective. He then tries other ways of trying to move perspective, most notably in this great painting, Mulholland Drive, where I've always contended that the word drive in that title is a verb. And it really is. Your eye goes for a drive, and at each different corner you see what you would see from that corner. You're kind of beginning to layer vantages one on top of another. But around this point, he has one of his seeming detours. Suddenly he's no longer painting, and for somebody who is very suspicious of photography, he sure is taking a lot of photographs, because he is in fact embarked on this Polaroid collages and then Pentax joiners, a whole series of these things. Once again, we're now 1980, 81, and 82, and we're beginning to have this thing where he goes off on a huge passion. He'll make something under 100 of these Polaroid collages, similar number of the Pentaxes. And one of the things that begins to happen, and you notice here, there were all kinds of photographers saying, see, you do like photography after all, but in fact, this is a critique of photography. This is about all the stuff you can't see in a normal photograph, or rather, this is about what it would be like to have a photograph that had multiple perspectives in it. It's a throwback to Cubism in some sense, which he has for years and years felt was the major event in the history of depiction, certainly in the last 500 years. And as such, he begins to think of it as a critique of photography. It's all the things you can't get in a photograph: multiple vantage points, passage of time, so forth and so on. But, and some of these are in fact almost literal Picasso-like references. This image of Celia, the photographer Bill Brandt, and his wife. What they were actually looking at, there's a picture of David's on the floor, but what they were actually looking at, kind of spellbound, was the picture itself coming into being. One of the things that happened when you did these pictures, it took a long time, because you would take a picture, it'd take 60 seconds for it to develop and then put it down and so forth. One of the things that would also have to happen is that he would have to move around a great deal. For example, in that image up at the top, up there, he would have had to move behind them. There's a great story of Stephen Spender being photographed in this manner by David, and David is 20 feet behind him, and Stephen is saying, "Are you still taking my picture, David?" Later, he moves on to a Pentax camera, and there it's a different way of doing it. He takes a lot of pictures very quickly, and then it's when he gets and he takes them to his local little kiosk photo development place, and hundreds and hundreds. I think he made that person a millionaire, that one particular franchise guy. And then he would take them back, and then he would work on making the collages at home, and that would take hours. Again, what you have here is a thing a photograph by itself could never capture. You have both his own feet, the detail of the grass, his mother at a place where she and his father used to go dating in the early days of their relationship, now a cemetery, this collapsed abbey. This, for example, one of the things that was fascinating in this is that if you do it, it'll look like you've created a monster. It takes an artist with a real sense of draftsmanship to be able to get the lines to line up with each other and so forth. But here you just have a picture of Billy Wilder lighting a cigar and looking up to continue the conversation. And in some ways, the most important thing here is this image here. If you put your hand in front of it, you'll see what a difference it makes in terms of locating you as the person, or in this case, him. But what's striking about these things is precisely that they don't look like monsters, that they look like what it looks like to look. One of the things he points out is that when you actually spend time looking at a person, you don't stare at them the way a camera does. You look up, you look down, you catch that image. If you look up, you look at their glasses and so forth. In fact, it's very rude to stare at them, but this is in fact what it looks like to look at someone. He goes to Japan. He does 2 views of the same place, one from sitting still, one from walking the distance. Oddly enough, when you walk, if you don't walk, if you go back and look at it this way, you don't get the classic Renaissance window, as you're looking at the world through a window. To get that classic Renaissance window, you, in fact, have to walk, with him walking there at the bottom. He begins to play with notions, for example, of reverse perspective, which is a very big deal with Cubism. In this case, you walk about the desk. You see it from all sides. If you look at it from this side, you see that and that. And if you look at it from this side, you see that and that. And that is something that Cubism spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do that. And he, in turn, translates that to his paintings. This is a visit that he does shortly in the midst of doing these collages. This is a visit to Christopher and Don's. He drives down, he parks his car, he comes down the steps. He sees the same, when he's up here, he sees the view there. When he's down here and sees Don has the view here, there's the view there. He comes through reverse perspective, walks through the whole house, comes and sees Christopher. Christopher also has the view. All these things are integrated into a single image that is trying to be more true to life. You have Pearl Blossom Highway, which is in some ways the masterpiece of this whole series, to give you some idea of how this is much truer to life than a standard photograph would be. This is what it feels like to be at the place. A standard photograph is this. And that's what it's like to be driving, to stop, to see up ahead the stop sign. And you can imagine, by the way, in this case, it took him days to do it. He had to get on ladders to take that photograph. He did all kinds of stuff he had to go on, walks all over the place and so forth. But the result is, indeed, his argument would be something that's more true to life, whereas photography pushes the world away from you in some profound sense. Now, the interesting thing about this, I mentioned that one of the passions that's happening in this period, in this kind of pivot period of the early 80s, is this notion that he's beginning to have that wider vantages are needed. We have to get out of the straitjacket of one-point perspective. And by that he means not only in painting, but television, billboards, everything in our society is one-point perspective. And in fact, it doesn't allow us wider vantages. But the other thing that is happening at this same time, and exactly the same years, is the sudden upsurge of AIDS. Up here you have one of those Polaroid collages. And this is his friend, the model Joe McDonald, who in fact is one of the early people with what becomes known as AIDS. This is Celia again, and you'll notice, by the way, Celia has a tea cup with a tea bag, and she's shaking out the water of the tea bag. It seems to me of the essence of the work of the last period since 1980, so the last 35 years, that this boy wonder who had lived this blithe life in California, the swimming pool, the male nudes, the lollygagging, the lounging about, suddenly comes into this horrific period where many, many, many of his friends are dying, and this very, very kind of dark, gruesome thing, which we all lived through. We remember it, especially here in this city. But it's striking that Hockney's response, rather than to fall into desolation or to become polemical, is over and over again to be true to life, to take all of this misery and to throw back life against death. One of the things that's very interesting in this context is that he does, for example, he does this series. Many of you have seen these wonderful photographs of his 2 dogs, Stanley and Booge. And I've often thought of them as direct consequence of AIDS. This is what you draw when you want to convey love, and you can no longer draw innocently male nudes in positions of languor and so forth. Many of these dog paintings are very, very similar to in terms of their postures and so forth, and overwhelmingly in terms of the love as opposed to lust, which I would argue is also the case with those male nudes. Those are not lustful images, they are pictures of love. And somehow he's able to keep that. Similarly, at this point, and this is again part of his attempt to break down one-point perspective, which he, by the way, equates with death. We have to find ways of breaking away from the death-like grip that keeps us centered in one-point perspective. And so I think that these two things, the coping with mortality that suddenly is hitting him around the age 40, and the wanting to explode out of one-point perspective, show up again and again in his work. And it's, as usual, David, not just in painting or in drawing. This is around the period when he starts doing all his amazing opera sets, which again, these are his models for Tristan, which when you think about Tristan in the context of AIDS, which was all over the place at that moment. But part of the point of that is you have to make an image that can be seen from all sorts of directions and is different in different places and so forth. He then, as life moves on into the later 80s, early 90s, he suffers not only the deaths of so many friends from AIDS, but Henry Geldzahler, who we saw at the beginning, dies of pancreatic cancer, and then Henry's role in his life as a sounding board and so forth is taken over by a friend from his hometown of Bradford, Jonathan Silver, for about 6 or 7 years they are having virtually daily conversations, and then Jonathan Silver suddenly takes ill, quite young, also of pancreatic cancer. And David moves back to England for a lot of that time. He is staying not in Bradford, his hometown, but in the town that he used to go to as a boy during the summers, the coastal town of Bridlington, which is where his mother, in her 90s, he has found her a place in this little dilapidated coastal town. And he is there, he is driving back and forth to York to see Jonathan on his sick bed, and he proceeds to do a series of very important paintings. This is the road through Sledmere on his way to York. This, in fact, is about a 2-minute section of the drive through Sledmere. But if you had a video, there are videos that you could see of the drive, you would see that as you come into town, you know you're kind of in town because you see this little phone booth over here over to the side. Then you drive along, and then you get down to the bottom here, and then you turn right, and then you see this house this way, then you see that house, then you see this wall. You never see it like this. This is a compression of what it's like to drive. This monument lets you know you're on the way out of town, and then you're continuing on. All these fields in reverse perspective, by the way, as are images like this, where he piles perspectives up one on top of the other. What's fascinating here, for example, is once you get to this point, you see this horizon. Once you get to this point, you see that horizon. These horizons are piled on top of each other, and this is even more the case in this picture here, which is the final picture of this series, although one that he does after he comes back to California from memory. This is the view of Garrowby Hill, and this is coming over the hill, and you see the whole vista with York Cathedral in the distance here, where his friend is sick. I often thought of this as him coming over his grief, and the whole horizon of new work opening out before him. Again, reverse perspective. One of the things that's fascinating about this picture, this is in Boston now, is that you can feel that you're driving, and you can feel that your back wheels are on the back side of the hill, and the front wheels are on the front side of the hill. You are swooshing into this new, what seemed like an open horizon. And he continues that sort of thing. What's fascinating here, for example, is you can tell that this is the walk up to his studio in his house in the Hollywood Hills, and you can tell that is downhill. That you come up the hill, you can tell the tree comes over you, this is not something you could take with a photograph, obviously. The way the tree surrounds you, how you can look that way, and so forth. These are the sorts of things he's doing. Now, we're now coming into the late 90s. And famously, he goes to see a show of the artist Ingres, of these. It was a retrospective, and while he was standing in front of some of these drawings he did, and the drawings are about that size, and they were done in Rome, they were done of English aristocrats who were coming on their grand tour, and they were kind of things that the aristocrats would come for a very fast sitting, have a fast drawing done, and that would take back with them to, and you find these kinds of drawings in English country homes all over to this day. But David was looking at this particular image, and he was saying, I know this line, I've seen this line before. First of all, the question is, how on earth was Ingres able to do this? This is such an incredible lifelike and so forth. And then he was saying, I know this line here. I've seen that line. Where have I seen it? And it took him a few days to remember he'd seen it in Andy Warhol. Now, when Andy Warhol does this, he does it with a projection, a slide projection. And he's able very quickly to move around because it's just a slide, and he's just basically tracing a slide. I mean, he's obviously Andy Warhol, so he's better than just you could trace it, but the tracing is important. And David becomes convinced that that is what, in fact, Ingres is doing too, that he must be using a camera lucida, which had been invented just a few years earlier, which is a little prism at the end of a stick. And the prism allows the artist to look through the flatness here and see the subject of the drawing over here, but see the paper below at the same time. And he's not suggesting that Ingres was using every single, was just tracing the image in front of him, but rather was getting the location. Let's go look back at the Ingres again. Let's see here. Figuring out the location of the eyelids, the nostrils, where the mouth would be, where the ears would be. He would put in a few very, very quick markings, which are the really hard thing to do if you're just eyeballing it, and then could go back to drawing, and then likewise with the clothes and so forth, and then would be able to go back to eyeballing it. As in this series of camera lucida drawings that David himself did of guards at the British Museum. People he'd never met before. Then David starts saying, well, wait a second. It wasn't just anger, and he began working his way back, and he said Caravaggio must have been using some kind of lens or something to get some of the effects that he was getting. He began seeing this, what he called an optical look, further and further back. And in fact, he set himself the challenge, and he built what's been described as the Great Wall, which you can hardly see it all there, but you can see it here in the show for the first time ever publicly. And he asked himself, he has this incredible library, art library. He's an amazing autodidact. He had went to a college of art, but not a sophisticated art history course, but he has, over the years, he keeps reading, and he has an incredible library of art history. And he installed in his studio in Santa Monica, which is the length of a tennis court, because it used to be a tennis court, and it's 2 stories high. And he installed a color photocopier, and he started photocopying the history of art and shingling it to the wall, 1350 to that side, 1900 to that side. He went around like that. And he asked himself the question, when does this optical look begin to happen? When do you go from this kind of awkwardness to something that we would associate with a photograph? It doesn't have to have the chemical properties of a photograph. It doesn't have to be on paper, but you get using lenses or something. And in a detail here, you can see 1350 leading to 1450, and it is you can see it just happen. It just happened suddenly. And it's not like Europe struggles to get there. It just is. It's as if Europe put on its glasses. And suddenly you get this you get it initially up in the north, and then comes down to the south. North was up, south was down. And it was so striking, and he became convinced that it was really Van Eyck and Brunelleschi and so forth are struggling, are getting toward it and get toward it within 10 years of each other. 1430 to 1440, 1425 to 1435, suddenly all over Europe, it's as if they put on their glasses, they are able to do, seemingly without struggle, what before was filled with awkwardness and so forth. This is not saying that Giotto is worse. This has to do with a particular look that begins to be enforced. A look that, as far as David is concerned, stays in effect until 1839, 1840. And if we look at the other side of the thing, suddenly in 1839, a chemical photograph is invented. So in other words, up till then, artists have been able to use photographic-like things, whether it was curved mirrors or lenses or camera obscura, camera lucida. But suddenly, it can be done on paper by a photographer. And then there's a crisis for European painting. In fact, in 1840, people are saying painting is dead. You don't need it anymore because you can do it with a camera. And at that point, European art falls away from the optical, looking in all sorts of directions at impressionism, expressionism, all the kinds of things that you can't capture with a camera, culminating, of course, in cubism, and so that you get awkwardness returning, as it were. These are non-optical. This is what you see, what they would argue actually see, as opposed to what a camera lets you think you see. Anyway, going back, key images in this thing. He begins working with a man named Charles Falco, who's a quantum optical scientist. He's a kind of scientist who does the optics of molecular electron photography. He has an incredibly expensive lab at the University of Arizona. He also parenthetically happens to be a motorcycle collector and had done a show at the Guggenheim, had curated a show of the art of the motorcycle. And when an article I wrote about David's theories about optics going back to Caravaggio came out, I got a call from him saying, I was at the Guggenheim, I have some standing, I'm a quantum scientist, I really should come over and talk to David. And he and I went to see David and walked up and down the wall, the Great Wall, which at this point had been put up, and kind of like, the two of them were like generals reviewing their troops. And David was saying, I'm convinced that Caravaggio was doing it, and there's all kinds of reasons to think that he might have been. But I think it goes all the way back here to Van Eyck. But I can't understand how Van Eyck could have been doing it because you would need to have a lens, and there's no evidence of lenses around at that time. And without missing a beat, Charles Falco said, yeah, but they had concave mirrors. And this is something that every optical scientist knows, and no art historian knows, that a concave mirror works exactly the same way as a lens. Try it at home yourself tomorrow morning when you have your shaving mirror or the makeup mirror, and it's bright outside and dark inside your bathroom. Just you can take the makeup mirror and you can do an upside down projection of the world onto the wall. By the way, it doesn't have to be a very good mirror. You can use your sieve. And it has exactly the same effect. A kitchen sieve with all those holes will have the thing of being able to turn it upside down. And in fact, it's basically that mirror there, only the reverse of it. In other words, the inside of that mirror would be a concave mirror. And those mirrors all start showing up in 1430. They weren't being portrayed before, and suddenly there they are. And at that point, Charles Falco is looking around, and he says, we can do a mathematical proof. And he's walking up and down. He says, I need a picture, I need this picture here. And it turns out, and this is described in detail elsewhere, that if you look carefully at what's going on here, this is in focus, it goes out of focus, it comes back into focus, goes out of focus again. And that you would had to be using a lens of a particular dimension, which he is able to prove what the dimension is. And by the time he's finished, he says that's what we call in science a proof. In any case, David starts doing the same thing. He has people sit outside. He has a concave mirror. He does an initial drawing upside down of them, and then he takes it right side up and does a regular drawing of them. In any case, this is the sort of thing this was a 2.5-year sidelight, which seemed to have nothing to do with anything except that it was all of a piece with this battle he was having against the death vice of one-point perspective. He was trying to figure out where it came in the history of art, where it goes out, what the bias for the optical is about. By the way, he's not, and it was always mischaracterized, he is not saying that every artist for 400 years traced every single line. That's not at all what he's saying. What he's saying is that there was a taste for the optical, that you wanted to do paintings that was privileged as what reality looked like. And that will last for about 400 years, 1430 to 1830. And it will be, and there's absolute amazing masterpieces that are done in this way. It's not at all a critique of that, but it's a critique of a kind of look and limitations of that look. Anyway, coming out of that, and now we get closer to what you'll find upstairs, he begins doing watercolors, which are conspicuously, it's the sort of thing where you can't go back and correct. It's not at all, you can't do optical watercolors. The hand immediately registers. You have to be very focused on what you're doing. You can't go back and correct. And he's trying to find ways of drawing without optical. When he was doing those camera lucidas drawings, he wasn't doing it because he thought that was the way to draw, but rather to figure out how it was done. But now he's trying to be out in nature, out in the world, figuring out ways to make bigger vantages. At first as these watercolors, then beginning to be with paintings. Generally speaking, around this time, he leaves Los Angeles and he goes to Bridlington. His mother had died, and the bed and breakfast that she had been living in, he took over, established a studio there, had rooms for his assistants and for visitors, and began portraying the fields of his summers. This is where he used to work when he was a young man, 17, 18, 19 years old, had summer jobs. It is the fields that he has scattered his mother's ashes in. Becomes his home. He continues to maintain the home in California, but he is really back home where he began, and he is back to first things. He is back to painting. And again, over and over again, he's trying to find ways to make for wider vantages. Initially a series of watercolors, then he goes to the same places and does, one summer he does this incredible series, one after another, of these oil paintings. By the way, this is like 6 o'clock in the morning, and this is 10 o'clock in the morning. And then he begins to want to do bigger pictures, and he wants to do them en plein air. Almost always when he has a body of work, it's under the impress of a particular master he's looking at. In this case, he's been looking at Constable, at those huge, amazing pictures that Constable made of English landscapes, which he couldn't possibly have been making in English landscapes. If you think about it, you have a canvas that size, and the wind kicks up, and it would just blow away. But he wants to figure out some way to do things of that size and to do them in the landscape, and he develops this idea of having multiple canvases and then working on sections of them, and then taking it back to the studio, and then coming back and so forth, and eventually getting things that look like this, and then repeatedly going back to the same places. There's an area of about 2 miles which after the Royal Academy show almost gets referred to as Hockney National Park. I mean, it's just that people start coming out to Bridlington, which, believe me, is out of the way. And one of the nice things about this part of England, by the way, is that it's off the main track and is not a place that's been painted that much. But in any case, there are particular places, for example, this little place in the woods where you have 4 roads, three of these paths coming together, and the road, the highway, is this highway here, Woldgate. And by the way, later on when we see all those images on video, that will be in a car coming this way, looking in that direction. But here's a place in the forest. He does the same place 9 times during that year, in different times of year. Some of them are upstairs. And you can really see how he has by this point triumphed over if you compare this and this, for example, this exactly is the vice of one-point perspective. This is something that allows you to move, to go on a walk yourself. You can go in this direction, you can go in that direction. One of the things that's fascinating about it is the passage of time. Earlier in the day, later in the day, the shadows are changing. This has time in it. This has incredible. It's been opened up. And this is over and over again what he's asked for, is this opening up. Notwithstanding which, there's this feeling of mortality, which is also partly conveyed through the seasons. There's a remarkable set of drawings that he does at one point when the foresters are thinning out the forest, which is what they need to do for it to be a vital and living place, and they pile all these logs on the side of the road. And David does this very, very moving series of drawings, charcoal drawings, charcoal being burnt wood on paper, pulped wood, of wood. And then, to my mind, an extraordinary drawing of what it looks like after they've been carted away. And you can't help but think of this in the context of life and death. And in fact, David himself, asks for a particular tree, the totem, as he calls it, to be left standing. And he will then go on to do a whole series of these images of the totem, the trees that have been chopped down, the totem as this kind of old, gnarled, in some ways a self-portrait almost. In any case, so he's doing that. At the same time, once again, he's about to take off on a side tangent, which is that a friend of his, parenthetically me, is showing him my iPhone one day, and he grabs it from me and starts playing with it for like 2 hours, and I have to explain to him how he has to give it back to me, that my whole life is on that thing. And in any case, rather quickly, he learns how to draw on iPhone. Now, it's interesting, by the way, he always is walking around in his pockets with sketchbooks. For a while, he was having sketchbooks with watercolors. He would prepare little bottles of watercolor to go with him on his walks, and you would see a lot of that, which were done on sketchbooks. But now he suddenly discovers that he can do it on his iPhone. And by the way, when he draws on the iPhone, there's a program called Brushes, and the way Brushes works is it gives you two different vectors. First of all, you press one button and you get an entire color wheel of possible colors, and you press, I want red, let's say, and you can then make the red darker or lighter. You can make it more translucent, less translucent. There are various indices like that. And then you press another button. You can say you want it thick, you want it thin, and so forth. And then you go onto the pad of the iPhone. I have one here. Don't turn on your iPhones right now, but on the pad, and you can just kind of draw. Now, the interesting thing is that with David, he draws with his thumb on the iPad. He's always drawing with his thumb. So that, for example, I am photographing him as he draws me. But you see how he's using his thumb. Later on, when he will be doing with the iPad, he'll be using his finger and using his elbow in a way. When he paints, he uses his shoulder. There's a whole different kind of way. But in any case, you get these rather amazing drawings. One of the things that's very interesting during this period is that he spends a lot of time thinking about how he could achieve an effect. How do you achieve the effect of glass? How do you achieve the effect of crystal, a flower, of a sunset, for example? And then he'll go and actually work on it. But a lot of this is intellectually figuring out how you could achieve some of these effects. He's very excited because for the first time in his life, he can draw sunrise. He's done a whole series of sunsets, which you can see how you can draw that. But sunrise, it's dark. And so you have to turn on the light to be able to draw it, but then you knock it out. But now when he can have the room be dark and he can be drawing with his thumb these sunrises. And then he moves indeed from that to the iPad, going back to some of the same places he'd been before. Eventually going to Yosemite. He also, another thing technology he's playing with is the technology of large-scale printing. he is almost always, whatever the most recent invention is, he either has it before everybody else has it because they give it to him to play with, or right when people get it. And he's trying to figure out how you can take an image from your iPad and blow it up to the size, right, frankly, almost of that size there. And as you'll see in the gallery, he's made huge strides in that direction. Similarly, he now is able to do something he'd wanted to do all the way back at the time of the Polaroid collages. Back in 1982, he'd said to me, God, I wish I could do this with film, have multiple perspectives in a grid. But in those days, cameras were too big. The technology, the digital technology was kind of hopeless and really wasn't possible. But just in the last few years, it has become possible. And he puts 9 cameras together in a grid inside of his car, for example, in this instance, or on the side of the car. He doesn't want to have them exactly on top of each other. He has slight distortions, and again, this is again to emphasize that this is 9 different perspectives. This is 9-point perspective, you could say, instead of 1-point perspective. And he then starts going down the road, and this, I mean, you obviously can't see it like this, and I couldn't even show you a video of it because that would be a 1-point perspective recreation of a 9-point perspective. But as it happens, when you go outside, you'll be able to go see them. He does the same route over and over again at different times of year, slowly moving, and it is a remarkable thing. In fact, it's almost disturbing to me. I very much hold with Jaron Lanier, who says that representation or reality, his great line about this is his critique of digital technology, is that reality is that thing that cannot be represented to completion. Reality is that thing that no matter how strong your representation of it is, it's what's missing. That's what you just can't make something as vivid as reality itself. But damn, these things feel more vivid than reality. And it's one of the things I want to explore on November 23rd when we have people from Silicon Valley and Hollywood talking about what the implications of this amount of vividness. When you're upstairs, I mean, it looks vivid here, but when you go upstairs, he has images of 18 screens going along the side of the road, looking at just the weeds, in the gully. And they have never looked so vivid. I mean, what comes to mind is the great line of Blake's, that were the doors of perception cleansed, we would see the world as it is, infinite. And there is a kind of splendor, of vitality in these images that really do surpass not only what other cinema does, but also, for that matter, it seems to be what reality itself does. So it's a bit kind of confusing. Coming full circle, and here I'm coming toward the end of the talk, and then I want to open up to conversation. At one point, as I said, this little area outside of Bridlington has become Hockney National Park, and there are people who come up and drive their cars slowly down that road, and they recognize certain things that are just the signposts where the 3 roads intersect. The hawthorn, people come up for the hawthorns in bloom, and they come up to see the famous totem that he's done over and over again. Earlier this year, David had a series of mini strokes, and he was beginning to slur his words and get slow in terms of talking, and indeed went to the hospital. It turned out that he had indeed, by the way, 76 years old. This was the first time he spent overnight in a hospital in his life. But he was checked out, he had an operation, and while he was in the hospital, first thing that happened is that the first trip is that somebody started putting graffiti all over the totem, and the second trip, somebody chopped it down. And David went into a 2-day dark depression, which I would again suggest has to do with his own identification with the totem, but also his own close brush with mortality with the stroke. He didn't get out of bed, and when he did get out of bed, he did a series of 4 absolutely remarkable, I have 3 of them here, of these drawings of the totem in the snow. And England being England, there was a phone call from The Guardian saying, we hear that the totem has been chopped down. Do you have any comment? And David said, well, actually, I've been drawing them. And so The Guardian put it above the cover, above the fold on the front page news. David's drawings of the felled tree. He was also, by the way, doing other charcoal drawings at this point, and partly what happens when something bad happens, this happens over and over again. You'll see it over and over again up there. Whenever there's an individual friend of his who dies, he gathers all the other friends together and does a suite of drawings, of portraits. Almost always when you have portraits in the more recent period, a big suite of them, it has to do with the fact that somebody has died. He's brought everybody together. He's portraying them to portray the life that remains. Around this time, he did, for example, this wonderful portrait of his sister, Margaret. That gleam is exactly right. That is her. And next to that is a picture of Dominique, one of his studio assistants, who then himself dies in tragic circumstances, and once again throws David. And David proceeds. It actually interrupts a project that he had been doing he had been going back to the same places that he'd portrayed earlier in watercolor, then in oil, then in iPad, and now he was doing it in charcoal. He was going to do the coming of spring. Each time it's the coming of spring, and he was doing 5 different locations at 5 different moments. It gets interrupted by the death of his friend Dominique, the studio assistant, but he returns to it finally and does this remarkable series of the same place seen 5 times as with the coming of spring. And then he comes back to Los Angeles, and this is where you get this incredible surge of portraits, starting with this one here, which is really extremely important. This is Jean-Pierre, another of the studio assistants. The rug very much captures the despair and the desolation about the loss of Dominique, I think, is partly it. It's also playing off of Van Gogh, but it is the occasion of the last few months of what David has done. Again, this explosion of work of portraits of friends. And it's with these 2 series that the show ends, and that we find David. These are all iPad drawings at the peak of his powers at the age of 76. Anyway, I think I'll stop there and maybe open it to questions. Can we? Questions or comments?
How's David doing?
Well, you can see. I mean, he was actually here the last few days. I think he's very excited about the show. He has recovered completely from the stroke in terms of the slurring and so forth, and he is incredibly vivid and vital. Knowing David, what will now happen is he'll go into kind of a sleeping exhaustion for a couple months. That's one of the things that also happens. He does these incredible furies of work and then subsides for a little bit. One of the things that's funny about David is that back in the 60s and so forth, he was imagined to be this kind of flaneur. You had all these pictures of him on vacation and in vacation spots, and you imagined him living this kind of life of leisure, which is true, except that he was working the whole time. He was doing drawings and paintings and so forth. He's an incredible hard worker. He would also be photographed occasionally going places, and then the photographs would show up in all the newspapers, so you imagine he was a partier. And in fact, as his hearing has gotten worse and worse, which is a problem, he hardly goes to parties at all. He just works and works and works, and I really think he's at the peak of his powers right now. And I agree with Colin that it is not at all the standard version of an old person's falling into darkness and bitterness. But it is this. But I would suggest that the work is, in fact, completely saturated with the presence of mortality and of death and death of friends and so forth, but in the mode of a refusal to give in to that. And so he's in great shape. The other way you know he's in great shape is that he bitches about cigarette smoking all the time, so he's fine. His intellectual screensaver is whenever he's not thinking about anything else, or whenever he's not working, and it's like the fish on your television on your video screen. He just rants about the rights of smokers, and he hasn't stopped doing that. So if that were to stop, I'd start worrying. But yeah, up there.
When you first came out with this book on the optical devices,
Mm-hmm. The question is, he found this is an art historian who found secret knowledge, which was his original arguments on behalf of this theory of his, persuasive, but how come none of the lenses have not been found, and there's been no written evidence? In fact, part of the reason is that people didn't know what they were looking for. So, for example, there is plenty of evidence that there were concave mirrors in Van Eyck's studio and so forth. Nobody thought to look that meant anything. Similarly, the evidence is often in the painting themselves, and there is actually a lot more writing by theorists about the use of lenses and projections and so forth early on, going back to the Arab theorists, mathematicians of the Middle Ages and so forth. But the trouble is that a lot of this stuff is conflated with magic. There are people, as late as 1600, Giordano Bruno is burned at the stake for playing with this sort of thing. There are all kinds of reasons to keep it a secret, both doctrinally. The church wants it kept secret because for arguments that David lays out, but also just if you're an artist, you want to have your own techniques secret. You don't tell everybody how you do things. And that, by the way, is to this day. People are always asking artists, how do you do that? They don't tell you how they do it. That's how they make their money. Anyway, I would suggest that a few things. First of all, that David is one of the great noticers. And what's great about that secret knowledge book is he's constantly noticing things. And whether or not his overall theory, the entire theory is right, he definitely has noticed some very interesting things. He has noticed those holes in the Caravaggio's, which nobody could figure out why they were there. And he has an account for why they would be there. He has noticed there's all these pinprick holes. One of the things that's very interesting, by the way, and it seems to me that his opponents would have to account for, is that some of these artists, there are no drawings. So there are very few drawings with Caravaggio. There are no drawings with Vermeer, and so forth. And that the reason for that, he would argue, is that a camera is being used, and up to this point, there's no account otherwise. But again, I think the major thing he'd want to say that he's, at the end of the day, not talking about every single painting of every single artist, but he's talking about the dominance of a particular kind of look. And there's no question that that kind of one-point perspective does come seemingly out of nowhere, and it then holds sway very strongly for 400 years. And his, I think, is an interesting argument. By the way, one of the great things is we'll never know. There's that great poem of Auden's, the archaeologist delves into dwellings vacancied long ago, about which he has not much for certain he can say, the lucky man. Guessing is more fun than knowing. It seems to me that there is a preponderance of evidence. A lot of the evidence is in the painting themselves, that he's on to a lot of interesting stuff. And it seems to me we're on the arc with art historians that goes from not true, not true, not true, not true, not true. We knew that all along. And we're well along in that arc in terms of the acceptance of Hockney's ideas here. Yeah.
So I'm curious with this 8-point perspective.
I think he's trying to make something that is truer to life. His argument would be that we don't that photography is okay if you don't mind looking at the world from the point of view of a paralyzed Cyclops for a split second. And he would argue that, for that matter, standard cinema, uses a camera the same way, that goes, it moves around, but it's still, at any given point, your head is in a vice, and that's not how we look. That a huge amount of how we look is memory, by the way. that when we're looking at somebody, especially looking at people, we look down, we look up, we look down, we look up, we construct in our minds different vantages and so forth. He makes a wonderful argument about Picasso's Marie-Thérèse. You know those pictures that have the two noses on one side and two eyes on one side and the nose over here and the mouth, you know. And he says that this is not abstraction. This is what a person looks like if you're up close kissing them. Which is absolutely true. I mean, that in fact, this is what intimacy feels like and it looks like. Partly because you know, you are looking away, closing your eyes, all those sorts of things like that. But also, these are things that a camera can't capture. Especially, a camera becomes worse and worse the closer you get. You know this if you ever come close to about to kiss somebody. Everything starts swimming around and so forth. That's what we love. That's why, parenthetically, the camera in cinema goes away from the thing and they go into the other room or something, you know, because you can't photograph that. It's not that it's obscene, it's just it's impossible to photograph with a single lens. But and he would argue that similarly, that it just feels more true to life to do this. And that's his point, and he's sticking to it. And I kind of agree with him, actually, I think. Let's see, other questions? Up there.
Comment about contemporaries of Hockney that he has influenced or have influenced him?
Question about contemporaries of Hockney's who he has influenced or have influenced him. First of all, Madison Avenue. I mean, whenever Hockney does these things, they show up all over the place. After he did the photo collages, you begin having those overlaps all over the place. And all. I mean, it's often the case that artists are. If you think about the way that artists are trying to teach you how to see at a given moment, or they reflect what it is like to look right now, and people who are engaged in the businesses of looking take it up. And Hockney is extremely influential in that regard. Apart from that, I think that I mean, I could name names of particular people who were his colleagues, who are in continual dialogue with him. You know, R.B. Kitai, people like that, for example. I think generally there's been great influence. For example, people like Chuck Close have been very, very interested in his theories, not so much imitating what he's doing, but there's a whole group of artists in particular who were fascinated by his arguments about the old masters. Art historians were scandalized. What is this bird doing talking back to us ornithologists? You know, I mean, at some profound, I mean, one of the things at this level, these artists are all such egomaniacs that they're kind of in their own world. And I include David in that regard. Up at the top, first the guy and then the woman.
The pictures you show.
Well, one of the things he says, interestingly, about, let me find some of this here. Just a second, I have to. Well, one of the things that's very interesting about these sorts of things, and especially even later, is he will say something to the effect, he say, "These are my figure paintings." And you say, "There are no figures in them, David." He said, "You are the figure." And in effect, he's arguing that if you look at those earlier ones, there is a kind of disembodiedness, he would argue, precisely imposed by its camera's viewpoint. Whereas what he is now trying to do, especially with the rooms themselves, is to get what it's like to be in the room rather than what it's like to look into the room. Phrased differently, in the earlier painting, he's hewing towards the Renaissance view of the window aesthetic, that a painting is like looking through a window. Later on, he comes to feel that the implied in looking through a window is a wall. And how do you get rid of that wall? And the way you do that is by not thinking in terms of looking through a window, but being in the thing itself. And that begins to create what we would call distortions, except that he would argue it's more real. Another example of what he's talking about is he says that when a 5-year-old is you give a 5-year-old a piece of paper, you say, draw me your house. And they put the front, the back, the doghouse in the backyard, the tree, everything. And then the teacher comes and says, no, you're doing it wrong. What you're supposed to do is to do it as if you were paralyzed, standing in one place and not able to move. Isn't that obvious? And he would say that, in fact, the child has it right. The child is portraying what it's like to live in the world of that house, whereas you have it wrong in insisting that you do it as if you were a camera and frozen in one place. And so he is trying to find ways in the later work of being more that kid and putting everything in the image. For example, that picture of the tree, that no camera could take that picture, but that is very much what it's like.
That's almost the opposite of the full frontal.
Yeah.
Folding portraits he's now making of people.
Right. So the more recent thing, the portraits I see is, he would argue actually that it is closer to these are portraits that he couldn't have done before, that it's based on all the stuff he's gotten. I'd want to hear him make that case more than I mean, again, this is like the last 2 months. But I would suggest that those portraits are different from the Percy and Ossie Clark, and the more recent portraits are different from this sort of thing. The space is different. This is much more of a photographic space, and the portraits today are in a kind of empty, open space that he struggled to get to, he would say. Others? Yeah, you first, yeah. There is, if you go off, one thing you might not have noticed when you came into the show is that originally they were going to have a whole room of the collages, Polaroid collages and so forth, but then he did that most recent body of work that literally you can feel the paint drying on, and so they had to push that stuff out. So as you enter the show, way off to the side, almost in a little janitor's room or something, are a few of the collages. None of the Polaroid collages, but many of them. There is a whole thing going on. I'm not sure whether they have the telephone pole here. Yeah. That one is really fascinating if you think of it, because what happens when you look at that one is you're looking down. There's a telephone pole, and then there's a thing going down the hill behind the telephone pole, and then there's looking all the way up to the top of the telephone pole. And that is designed for you to, in fact, do something you would never do in an ordinary photograph, which is to look down and then look up. And in so doing, one of the things that happens with that particular picture is his version of a Cubist guitar. When you go look at it, you'll see there's the fretting of the telephone pole, there's the wires, and then there's the telephone, the box, the mailbox that he's photographed in a way that you can literally feel like you could put your finger into the little knob and pull on it, and then it goes down below. But that is very consciously his version of a Cubist guitar, and a Cubist guitar is very consciously Picasso's version of trying to play with that problem of how do you get so many different aspects in. But he does that a lot, of playing up and down, and that's the one that I think of most exactly. Over here. Right. So he's just saying that is in fact the case, that one of the things you can do with brushes is you can replay every single thing. And in fact, in the show, there's a room that has 4 or 5 of them, or actually they have several of them going. One thing I'm disappointed in a little bit is that you don't see, I would love for you to be able to see what they look like when they're on an iPad itself. And one of the things that's really interesting about that, by the way, if you'll allow me 1 second here, is that when he was sending these to people, you'd be getting 2 or 3 of these a day, and these are originals. Which is to say that there is no place that there is a better quality version. This is absolutely this is, by the way, look at that. Is that great or what? This reminds me of something that happened years ago. It's time out for a fast story. I was giving a talk at the Huntington about Vermeer, and it was to 800 university art book editors. And the Huntington did not have a slide projector This is in the days when you would assume they did. I brought my carousel. They did not have a slide projector. And I had in my pocket a book this size, I swear to God, of the complete works of Vermeer. And the lecture was on Vermeer. And so I said, in this picture here, and I swear to God, the people in the back, they were going, anyway, but in that spirit, I offer you. But I mean, for example, look at that, how he gets porcelain, how he's figured out how to do both porcelain and glass. Can you see it at all? Or brick, how brick turns out to be red and blue. The man you want to email is right there. That's he's right there, Gregory, and you can ask him. But anyway, you get the idea. Let's see, one or two more questions maybe. Anybody else?
Well, I want to keep mine. What about the paper?
Oh, I'm sorry, the size of paper. And the reason I didn't answer that is because I don't know. I mean, I think at one level, if he were here, he'd be the person to ask. But at one level, I think it's what's at hand. Initially, if he just wants to work on something, and that is at hand. And then when he gets serious about it, he'll tend to go bigger. But there are many things that a lot of it, by the way, is done, in fact, with sketchbooks. And I think I mentioned it. I certainly say it in the essay that one of the things that was fascinating when he was working with the digital, when he would work on the iPhone, is that he would work, that then when he was finished, out of habit, he would wipe the smudge off, the digital smudge off his hand and put it in his pocket. So anyway, one last question. Yeah, who is it? Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to ask you, you can talk about how he goes from landscape to people. It seems such a dramatic change, and say Chuck Close doesn't do that.
Yeah, no, yeah.
What
And by the way, I mean, it's not just landscapes and people. There's all kinds of other things, too. And I guess I would say that well, first of all, he's constantly drawing people who are in his midst. So if you go to visit him, you get drawn. Just it's kind of an almost nervous energy. But so there's sketchbooks full of people all the time. I would say that it has been my observation that very often the suites of portraits of people have to do with somebody having just died. There's a tremendous suite that was done after his mother died. There's the ones that just now are very much in the wake of his studio assistant having died. There was a whole suite of them when Jonathan died, when Henry died, and so forth. And in terms of the landscapes, which I think in general, I mean, there used to be things like poolscapes and so forth in the 60s, and that had to do very much with the surface of color, and playing with surfaces and with canvas and paint and water and reflection and so forth. That was what that was about. But in terms of going after landscape as such, and I may be wrong about this, but it really feels to me that comes in the wake of his attack on one-point perspective. And it has to do, the passion has to do with this thing he says over and over again: wider perspectives are needed now. When this is a bigger exhibition, the bigger is about the wider. It's about finding ways to see in bigger and wider ways. I think maybe that's a good place to stop. Okay, thank you.